The trembling hand of an elderly man slid a pristine Purple Heart medal across the cold glass counter of a dusty pawn shop on Jefferson Avenue. The old man was soaked from the freezing rain, his shoulders slumped under a worn olive jacket, and his eyes carried the heavy glaze of someone who had not eaten a single meal in 2 full days. He only needed $40, just enough for basic groceries to survive another week. But every ounce of his warrior pride was tearing apart inside. The pawnshop owner picked up the historic medal, turning it over with an indifferent shrug, and muttered that $40 was a deal. The old man hesitated, his fingers hovering over the glass as if trying to pull back a lifetime of sacrifice. But the brutal reality of hunger was winning the battle. Suddenly, a commanding voice shattered the quiet desperation of the room, shouting for the owner to stop and freeze right there. Henry Griffin, a 26-year-old black Marine reservist, stepped forward from the back of the shop. His eyes locked onto the legendary Navy SEAL trident hidden beneath the old man's frayed sleeve. Henry reached into his own pocket, pulled out his last 2 $20 bills, and slammed them onto the counter, demanding that the owner return the medal to its rightful owner, because that sacred piece of history was not being sold today. The old man turned in absolute shock, his voice cracking as he whispered that he did not need any charity from a stranger, but Henry simply looked him in the eye and said that the medal stays with him, because brothers do not let brothers sell their souls for bread. Henry walked out into the pouring rain, completely broke, having given away every single penny he owned to a man he had never met before, unaware that this 5-second decision was about to trigger a massive chain of events that would completely rewrite his future. To truly comprehend why Henry Griffin would give away his absolute last dollar to a total stranger, you have to look deeper into the incredibly heavy burden he was already carrying on his own shoulders. Exactly 6 hours before walking into that pawn shop, Henry's day began in the pitch black of 5 o'clock in the morning in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment sitting directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat in downtown Norfolk. The sharp buzz of a cracked phone screen pierced the darkness, and Henry's hand found the silence button on the first try, a strict military habit that never required a second reminder. He sat up on the edge of his thin twin mattress, rubbing his face as the floorboards vibrated from the heavy washing machines spinning downstairs. His apartment was small, and the wallpaper was peeling from old water stains, but the entire space was maintained with a flawless, disciplined precision that reflected his years of active service. His work boots were perfectly aligned by the front door. His immaculate marine dress uniform hung behind a protective plastic sheet in the closet. And on the small wooden shelf sat a single-framed photograph of his late mother, Vanessa, wearing her Navy nurse uniform. She had passed away in a tragic car accident on a rainy highway when Henry was only 9 years old, leaving him with nothing but a folded American flag and a legacy of ultimate kindness. Next to her photo sat a yellowing legal pad where Henry had spent the last 3 years, meticulously sketching out blueprints for a dream that felt impossible, a community mentorship center where neighborhood kids could find free tutoring, hot meals, and a safe haven from the rough streets. Henry stood up, his joints popping from the brutal physical toll of working 2 separate jobs just to keep his family afloat, and quietly cracked open the door to the adjacent bedroom. His 69-year-old grandmother, Loretta, was still fast asleep, her breathing shallow as her diabetic medication kit sat on the nightstand beside a terrifying mountain of unpaid medical bills and past due notices for rent. Henry picked up the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, flipping through the numbers with a sinking heart, because he already knew the grim reality by heart. He opened his mobile banking app to see a devastating total of $38.12 left to his name, a tiny amount that needed to cover groceries, insulin refills, and gas for his aging truck. He skipped breakfast entirely to save the remaining box of cereal for his grandmother, grabbed his keys, and stepped out into the freezing morning fog, determined to fight through another exhausting shift at the auto body shop. By 7 in the morning, Henry was already underneath a rusted sedan at Patterson's Auto Body, his hands covered in dark motor oil as the chemical smell of paint thinner filled his lungs. He was widely recognized as the most talented mechanic in the entire facility, yet he was paid the absolute lowest because he refused to cut corners or overcharge desperate customers who walked through the door. At 9 o'clock, a young mother pulled into the bay with tears in her eyes, frantically explaining that her brake lights were completely out, but she only had $5 until her next paycheck. Henry smiled gently, popped the light housing open, swapped the bad bulb within 10 minutes, and waved her wallet away, telling her to take care of her kids instead. His co-worker Tommy leaned against a nearby hydraulic lift, shaking his head in disbelief and warning Henry that his endless generosity would keep him broke for the rest of his life. Henry didn't even look up from his wrench, calmly replying that he would rather be broke and useful to this world than rich and selfish, treating the statement not as a joke, but as his ultimate truth. During his brief lunch break, Henry sat inside the cabin of his old truck with the engine turned off, staring intensely at the first page of his legal pad where his mother had written a final note before she died. The faded ink read that if you cannot feed 100 people, you must focus all your strength on feeding just one. Henry ran his calloused thumb over her beautiful handwriting, closing the pad and burying his face in his hands as the crushing weight of his financial reality closed in on him. He had absolutely no idea that in less than 3 hours, those exact words from his mother would guide his hand to save a legendary warrior who was fighting a silent war of his own. The trembling hand of an elderly man slid a pristine Purple Heart medal across the cold glass counter of a dusty pawn shop on Jefferson Avenue. The old man was soaked from the freezing rain, his shoulders slumped under a worn olive jacket, and his eyes carried the heavy glaze of someone who had not eaten a single meal in 2 full days. He only needed $40, just enough for basic groceries to survive another week, but every ounce of his warrior pride was tearing apart inside. The pawn shop owner picked up the historic medal, turning it over with an indifferent shrug, and muttered that $40 was a deal. The old man hesitated, his fingers hovering over the glass as if trying to pull back a lifetime of sacrifice, but the brutal reality of hunger was winning the battle. Suddenly, a commanding voice shattered the quiet desperation of the room, shouting for the owner to stop and freeze right there. Henry Griffin, a 26-year-old black Marine reservist, stepped forward from the back of the shop, his eyes locked onto the legendary Navy SEAL trident, hidden beneath the old man's frayed sleeve. Henry reached into his own pocket, pulled out his last 2 $20 bills, and slammed them onto the counter, demanding that the owner return the medal to its rightful owner, because that sacred piece of history was not being sold today. The old man turned in absolute shock, his voice cracking as he whispered that he did not need any charity from a stranger, but Henry simply looked him in the eye and said that the medal stays with him, because brothers do not let brothers sell their souls for bread. Henry walked out into the pouring rain, completely broke, having given away every single penny he owned to a man he had never met before, unaware that this 5-second decision was about to trigger a massive chain of events that would completely rewrite his future. To truly comprehend why Henry Griffin would give away his absolute last dollar to a total stranger, you have to look deeper into the incredibly heavy burden he was already carrying on his own shoulders. Exactly 6 hours before walking into that pawn shop, Henry's day began in the pitch black of 5 o'clock in the morning, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment sitting directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat in downtown Norfolk. The sharp buzz of a cracked phone screen pierced the darkness, and Henry's hand found the silence button on the first try, a strict military habit that never required a second reminder. He sat up on the edge of his thin twin mattress, rubbing his face as the floorboards vibrated from the heavy washing machines spinning downstairs. His apartment was small, and the wallpaper was peeling from old water stains, but the entire space was maintained with a flawless, disciplined precision that reflected his years of active service. His work boots were perfectly aligned by the front door. His immaculate marine dress uniform hung behind a protective plastic sheet in the closet, and on the small wooden shelf sat a single framed photograph of his late mother Vanessa wearing her Navy nurse uniform. She had passed away in a tragic car accident on a rainy highway when Henry was only 9 years old, leaving him with nothing but a folded American flag and a legacy of ultimate kindness. Next to her photo sat a yellowing legal pad, where Henry had spent the last 3 years meticulously sketching out blueprints for a dream that felt impossible. A community mentorship center where neighborhood kids could find free tutoring, hot meals, and a safe haven from the rough streets. Henry stood up, his joints popping from the brutal physical toll of working 2 separate jobs just to keep his family afloat, and quietly cracked open the door to the adjacent bedroom. His 69-year-old grandmother, Loretta, was still fast asleep, her breathing shallow as her diabetic medication kit sat on the nightstand beside a terrifying mountain of unpaid medical bills and past-due notices for rent. Henry picked up the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, flipping through the numbers with a sinking heart, because he already knew the grim reality by heart. He opened his mobile banking app to see a devastating total of $38.12 left to his name, a tiny amount that needed to cover groceries, insulin refills, and gas for his aging truck. He skipped breakfast entirely to save the remaining box of cereal, for his grandmother grabbed his keys and stepped out into the freezing morning fog, determined to fight through another exhausting shift at the auto body shop. By 7 in the morning, Henry was already underneath a rusted sedan at Patterson's Auto Body, his hands covered in dark motor oil as the chemical smell of paint thinner filled his lungs. He was widely recognized as the most talented mechanic in the entire facility, yet he was paid the absolute lowest because he refused to cut corners or overcharge desperate customers who walked through the door. At 9 o'clock, a young mother pulled into the bay with tears in her eyes, frantically explaining that her brake lights were completely out, but she only had $5 until her next paycheck. Henry smiled, gently popped the light housing open, swapped the bad bulb within 10 minutes, and waved her wallet away, telling her to take care of her kids instead. His co-worker Tommy leaned against a nearby hydraulic lift, shaking his head in disbelief and warning Henry that his endless generosity would keep him broke for the rest of his life. Henry didn't even look up from his wrench, calmly replying that he would rather be broke and useful to this world than rich and selfish, treating the statement not as a joke, but as his ultimate truth. During his brief lunch break, Henry sat inside the cabin of his old truck with the engine turned off, staring intensely at the first page of his legal pad where his mother had written a final note before she died. The faded ink read that if you cannot feed 100 people, you must focus all your strength on feeding just one. Henry ran his callous thumb over her beautiful handwriting, closing the pad and burying his face in his hands as the crushing weight of his financial reality closed in on him. He had absolutely no idea that in less than 3 hours, those exact words from his mother would guide his hand to save a legendary warrior who was fighting a silent war of his own. The heavy downpour of rain was hitting the asphalt sideways as Henry Griffin pushed through the glass door of the pawn shop and walked toward his aging pickup truck. His old F-150 had a severely cracked windshield, over 200,000 miles of hard wear on the odometer, and an engine that coughed violently before finally sputtering to life. Henry sat inside the cold cabin for a long moment, staring down into the completely empty leather slots of his wallet where his last $40 had been just moments ago. He had absolutely no grocery money left for the week, no funds to refill his grandmother's vital prescriptions, and barely enough fuel in the tank to make it through the next 2 days of work. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, pressing his forehead against the cold steering wheel, as he muttered to himself that he had just given away his entire life savings to a total stranger. He wanted to laugh at the sheer absurdity of his financial recklessness, but deep down he knew it was exactly the kind of radical kindness his mother would have shown. Looking through the rain-streaked passenger window, Henry noticed Walter Barrett standing completely frozen at the very edge of the dark parking lot. The old man didn't have an umbrella or a vehicle, standing completely exposed to the freezing rain while holding his returned Purple Heart tightly in one hand and the crumpled bills in the other. He was staring blankly at the busy intersection, as if he had completely forgotten which direction led back to his lonely room, his thin legs shaking visibly from exhaustion. Henry watched him for 15 agonizing seconds, his logical mind screaming at him to drive away because he had already done more than enough for a stranger. Shaking his head, Henry flung the truck door open, stepped out into the pouring rain, and called out to the old man, asking where he was heading. Walter turned his head slowly, his piercing blue eyes filled with an intense, guarded suspicion that belonged to a seasoned warrior who spent his life analyzing threats. Walter waved a frail hand vaguely down the street, claiming that his destination was just a few blocks east, but Henry could easily see through the proud lie. Henry stepped closer, his voice firm and unyielding, as he commanded the old man to get inside the truck before he collapsed onto the wet pavement from starvation. Walter's jaw tightened as he chewed on his immense pride, desperately trying to swallow his reluctance while looking at the warm interior of the truck cab. Finally, the sheer weight of physical exhaustion broke his resistance, and he quietly opened the passenger door, climbing into the seat with a heavy sigh. They drove down Jefferson Avenue in absolute silence for the first 2 miles, with the only sound being the rhythmic slapping of the wipers against the glass. Henry carefully watched the old man from the corner of his eye, noticing that despite being soaked to the skin and half-starved, Walter sat with a perfectly straight spine and square shoulders. He was sitting at absolute parade rest inside the pickup truck, his head turning with a disciplined regularity to check the side mirrors and catalog every single vehicle behind them. This was not the random paranoia of a broken mind. It was the deeply ingrained tactical awareness of an elite special forces operator that could never be turned off. When a reckless driver suddenly honked loudly behind them at a red light, Henry noticed Walter's right hand instantly shoot down to grip the door handle with white-knuckled intensity. Henry chose to say absolutely nothing about the reaction, recognizing the symptoms immediately from veterans in his own reserve unit, whose bodies remembered battles their mouths refused to speak about. Henry cleared his throat, asking a casual question about when the old man had finally gotten out of the service. Walter continued to stare straight through the windshield, his voice flat and tired, as he asked Henry to define what getting out actually meant. Henry nodded in understanding, offering a comfortable silence before Walter spoke again, revealing that he had served 34 years, enduring 5 combat deployments and 3 major wars. Henry shared that he had completed 4 years of active duty before joining the reserves as a motor transport specialist, asking Walter what his specific job classification had been. Walter let out a faint, dry smile, replying that his specific military occupational specialty was the highly classified kind that they never actually print on a standard discharge paper. Henry carefully filed that fascinating detail away in his mind, realizing more than ever that this mysterious old man was far more than a simple, homeless veteran. Henry suddenly pulled his truck into the crowded parking lot of the Save Right grocery store, telling Walter to wait inside the vehicle while he stepped out. Henry didn't have a single dollar in his pocket, but he had lived in this specific neighborhood his entire life, and the store manager, a kind woman named Pam, had known him since childhood. Henry walked directly into her office, explained the old veteran's desperate situation in 15 seconds, and asked if he could possibly buy a few basic items on store credit until Friday. Pam looked at Henry's honest, wet face, smiling softly as she told him that he had been helping everyone else his whole life and to go grab whatever he needed. Henry quickly walked through the aisles, grabbing a basket and filling it with simple, nourishing items like bread, fresh eggs, canned soup, bananas, and a gallon of whole milk. He returned to the truck, placing the heavy grocery bags directly onto Walter's lap, causing the old man to stare down at the food in absolute bewilderment. Walter's lips pressed together tightly as he looked up at Henry, his voice cracking with emotion as he demanded to know why a young stranger was doing all of this for him. Henry put the truck back into drive, calmly stating that someone had done the exact same thing for his family when he was an 11-year-old kid struggling to survive, and he promised to keep passing the kindness forward until the cosmic math finally worked out. The old pickup truck rattled to a halt in front of a run-down 2-story brick building located directly above a noisy downtown hardware store. Walter Barrett sat completely motionless in the passenger seat. For a long moment, his eyes staring down at the heavy bags of groceries resting on his lap. He reached deep inside his wet olive jacket, but instead of pulling out money, his fingers emerged, holding a heavy, beautifully crafted brass challenge coin. The edges of the circular metal were completely worn smooth from decades of being turned over in his pockets, indicating its immense sentimental value. On the front face of the coin was a highly detailed insignia featuring a powerful eagle clutching a polished shield with tiny engraved letters underneath. On the reverse side, a bold inscription was deeply carved into the metal, reading that true brotherhood possesses an absolute expiration date, followed by the initials WB. Walter gently placed the heavy coin directly into Henry's calloused palm, telling the young Marine reservist that he had thoroughly earned it through his actions today. Henry turned the brass coin over beneath the dim amber glow of the truck's dashboard light, trying to read the incredibly small letters etched into the metal design. The text surrounding the shield read, "Ironclad Security Group," a name that meant absolutely nothing to Henry at that particular moment in his life. Henry offered a sincere thank you to the old veteran, and Walter gave a single, disciplined nod before opening the truck door and disappearing quickly into the dark staircase of the building. Henry sat alone in the idling truck for several minutes, looking at the empty leather slots of his wallet, then looking down at the mysterious brass coin in his hand. He safely tucked the token into his front pocket and drove home through the dark streets, genuinely believing he had simply helped an old soldier survive a tough week. By 6:30 that evening, Henry walked through the front door of his small apartment, the air smelling heavily of wet asphalt and heavy motor oil. His grandmother Loretta was standing over the small gas stove in her worn house slippers, slowly stirring a steaming pot of white rice, while the evening news played softly on a tiny television in the corner. She didn't even turn around to look at him, her sharp instincts immediately identifying her grandson's distinct footsteps as she noted that he was late getting home. Henry dropped his keys onto the counter, claiming that he had simply stayed at the auto body shop a little longer to finish up a difficult repair job. Loretta turned around slowly, her sharp eyes instantly locking on to the single small plastic grocery bag Henry had placed on the kitchen counter. She had sent him out that morning with a comprehensive list of 9 essential household items, but he had returned with nothing but a single loaf of bread and a few bananas. Loretta Griffin was 69 years old with severe arthritis in both of her knees, but her brilliant mind remained as sharp and unyielding as a razor blade. She called out his full name, Henry James Griffin, using the strict tone that always signaled a serious conversation was about to take place. Henry sighed deeply as his grandmother demanded to know what had happened to the grocery money and why the rest of the items were missing. Henry looked down at his boots, admitting that he would have to go back to the store on Friday afternoon as soon as his next paycheck was deposited. Loretta crossed her arms, stating plainly that Friday was 5 long days away, and directly asked him who he had given the money away to this time. Henry sat down heavily at the small kitchen table, explaining that an elderly Navy SEAL was at the pawn shop trying to trade his Purple Heart medal just to buy basic food. He looked up at his grandmother, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability as he confessed that his heart simply wouldn't allow him to sit back and watch that happen. Loretta shook her head slowly, her face showing an expression of profound recognition rather than anger or disappointment. She smiled softly, telling Henry that he was the exact living image of his late mother, who would easily give away her only coat during a freezing blizzard and walk home with a smile on her face. Henry pulled the heavy brass challenge coin from his front pocket and placed it gently onto the center of the wooden table for her to see. Loretta picked up the metal token, holding it close to her eyes as her fingers traced the inspiring words about brotherhood having no expiration date. She noted that a man who carries an object of such profound weight must have an incredible life story hidden beneath his rugged exterior, suggesting that Henry had given the old man far more than simple groceries today. Henry took the coin back, holding it tightly in his hand before placing it reverently on his bedroom nightstand right next to his mother's photograph and the folded American flag. Those 3 distinct objects stood in a neat row, a mother's loving memory, a nation's deep gratitude, and a mysterious stranger's heavy coin. Henry went to sleep that night, completely unaware that the 3rd object on his shelf possessed a hidden value that would soon change his entire world. 2 days later, on a chilly Thursday morning, Henry Griffin arrived at Patterson's Auto Body 30 minutes before the shop was scheduled to open. As he walked up to the front entrance, he noticed a plain white legal envelope tucked neatly underneath the heavy metal door. There was no postage stamp, no return address, and no markings other than 2 words written across the front in an incredibly precise, elegant calligraphy style that read, "The Marine." Henry quickly tore open the envelope, and his eyes went wide as he pulled out 10 crisp, uncirculated $20 bills totaling $200 in cash. Tucked inside the money was a small piece of lined notebook paper containing a brief handwritten message, thanking him for the groceries and the ride, stating that Henry didn't have to help, which was exactly why it mattered so much. Signed with the initials W.B. Henry stared at the money in absolute disbelief, realizing that $200 would instantly solve every single financial crisis his family was facing this week. It would completely cover his grandmother's insulin refill, pay off the past due balance on his truck, and leave enough left over to pay the electric bill. He carefully folded the handwritten note, placed it into his front shirt pocket, and slid the $10, $20 bills back inside the white envelope. After completing his exhausting 10-hour shift at the mechanic's shop, Henry drove his truck back to the rundown building above the hardware store. He climbed the narrow, creaking wooden staircase, located the correct door at the end of the hallway, and knocked firmly 3 times. The door swung open, and Walter Barrett stood in the entrance, his sharp blue eyes instantly conducting a flawless tactical assessment of Henry's posture. Henry extended his hand, holding out the white envelope, and stated that while he deeply appreciated the immense gesture, he had not helped the old man for money. Henry looked Walter dead in the eye, explaining that he had stepped in because they were brothers in service and members of the military family do not charge each other for basic survival. Walter stared at the extended envelope for a long, heavy moment, a profound silence filling the hallway as he analyzed the young Marine's unyielding integrity. A subtle shift occurred deep behind Walter's weathered eyes, replacing his cold defense mechanisms with an immense wave of mutual respect. Walter quietly took the envelope back, nodded his head slowly, and stepped aside, inviting the young Marine to come inside and join him for a cup of black coffee. Henry stepped into the tiny apartment, and as he sat down on the single folding metal chair by the window, his eyes naturally drifted toward the wooden shelf. He noticed that the cardboard shoebox was sitting wide open, revealing the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, the beautiful photograph of Helen, and the faded corporate identification badge. Henry caught a glimpse of the identical eagle and shield insignia printed on the badge, along with the bold text identifying Walter Barrett as the co-founder of Ironclad Security Group. Henry looked away quickly, refusing to pry into the old man's personal life, and focused on drinking the strong, bitter coffee Walter had prepared. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, a remarkable bond began to form between the two veterans as Henry started visiting the small apartment multiple times a week. Henry would frequently show up after his long shifts, bringing heavy plastic containers filled with delicious leftovers that his grandmother had packed, including warm rice-stewed chicken and homemade cornbread. They would sit together for hours beside the small window, drinking cheap coffee from an old dented percolator and sharing stories about their time in uniform. Walter would share fascinating, vague accounts of historical operations without ever revealing the specific geographic locations or using his teammates' real last names. He spoke beautifully about his late wife Helen, describing the way her infectious laugh could instantly light up a dark room, and how she hummed beautiful melodies while working in the kitchen. Crucially, Walter never made a single mention of his former corporate life, his massive personal wealth, or the multi-million-dollar empire he had left behind. One rainy evening, Henry brought his yellow legal pad along nervously, showing Walter his highly detailed sketches and floor plans for the Dream Community Mentorship Center. Walter held the pad close to his face under the dim light, studying the room layouts, the tutoring schedules, and the list of local volunteers with extreme analytical precision. Walter suddenly began firing off a series of highly sophisticated business questions, demanding to know what kind of liability insurance structure Henry had established to protect the property if a child were to get injured. Henry blinked in total confusion, admitting that he had not thought that far ahead, and Walter pressed further, asking about the projected operational budget for the first 3 years of service. Walter explained that a new non-profit venture requires a minimum of 12 months of solid financial runway before public donations begin to stabilize. Henry stared at the old man in absolute amazement, asking him how a homeless veteran living in a tiny rented room could possibly possess such an advanced knowledge of corporate finance. Walter quickly handed the legal pad back calmly, claiming that he simply read a lot of books, hiding the fact that he had single-handedly built an empire from the ground up. As the weeks continued to pass, Henry Griffin began to notice several bizarre occurrences in the neighborhood that he couldn't quite explain. On a Tuesday afternoon, he spotted a massive, immaculate black SUV parked directly across the street from Walter's apartment building, with its engine idling quietly. The vehicle featured heavily tinted windows that completely obscured the driver, and it was outfitted with high-end government contractor license plates. A few days later, Henry saw the exact same black SUV hovering near the edge of the Save Right grocery store parking lot while he was picking up milk. Norfolk was a massive military town filled with various government personnel, so Henry initially dismissed the site as a routine security detail. However, he noticed that whenever Walter caught a glimpse of the dark vehicle through his window, the old man would instantly fall completely silent, pull the curtains tightly shut, and immediately change the subject of conversation. A few days later, Henry was standing at the grocery store checkout line, digging through his pockets to find his truck keys. The young cashier, a friendly neighborhood woman named Denise, suddenly noticed the heavy brass challenge coin attached to Henry's keychain. Her eyes went wide with excitement as she asked Henry if that was an official, authentic Ironclad Security Group corporate token. Henry looked down at his keys, confused, and asked her what Ironclad actually was, prompting Denise to explain that her cousin worked in high-level private security and recognized the elite logo instantly. She revealed that Ironclad was an absolute titan in the global defense industry, functioning as a massive government contractor that handled multi-million-dollar international operations. Henry let out a loud laugh, shaking his head, as he told Denise that the old man who gave him the coin could barely afford a $4 can of soup. Denise simply shrugged her shoulders, looking Henry dead in the eye, as she warned him that the elite logo on his keychain was worth a massive fortune to the right people. Henry pocketed his keys and drove away, completely dismissing the conversation because it seemed entirely impossible that a broke old veteran living above a hardware store could be a wealthy tycoon. However, everything Henry thought he knew about the mysterious life of Walter Barrett was about to completely shatter into a million pieces on a stormy Tuesday evening. At 6:15, Henry climbed the narrow wooden staircase of Walter's building, carrying a heavy brown paper bag filled with a fresh batch of his grandmother's warm beef stew and cornbread. He knocked firmly on the door, but received absolute silence from the interior, prompting him to knock a second time, even louder. Sensing that something was wrong, Henry reached down and turned the doorknob, discovering that the lock was completely disengaged. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, instantly dropping the heavy bag of food onto the floor as his heart plummeted into his stomach. Walter Barrett was collapsed on the hard linoleum floor, his back propped awkwardly against the wall and his long legs stretched out across the room. He was still conscious, but his breathing was dangerously shallow. His skin had turned the terrifying color of old paper, and his eyes were completely glassy and unfocused. Henry rushed across the room in 3 massive steps, kneeling down beside the fallen warrior and gently lifting his head to check his vitals. Henry gripped the old man's shoulders, pleading with him to lock his eyes onto his face, demanding to know the last time he had consumed food or water. Walter was completely unable to articulate a response, his frail body trembling violently as his internal systems slowly began to shut down from extreme starvation and dehydration. Henry's advanced military first aid training instantly kicked in, and he carefully verified that Walter's airway was completely clear before checking his pulse, finding it incredibly fast but dangerously weak. This was not the result of a physical fall or a sudden injury. This was the slow, agonizing collapse of an elderly man who had completely given up on his own survival. Henry grabbed a fresh bottle of water from the room, carefully unscrewed the cap, and held it gently against Walter's dry, cracked lips, encouraging him to take small, slow sips. Walter drank the water desperately, coughing violently before taking another sip, as the vital hydration slowly entered his system. Henry immediately reached into his pocket to pull out his phone, stating firmly that he was calling an emergency ambulance right this second. Suddenly, Walter's hand shot forward with an unexpected burst of desperate energy, clamping down around Henry's wrist with a white-knuckled grip. His piercing blue eyes were wide with an intense, suffocating fear, as he whispered a desperate plea for Henry to put the phone away, begging him not to involve any hospitals. Henry froze completely in place, looking down at the old man's trembling hand, and asked him a terrifying question. Who exactly was he running from that would find him at a hospital? Walter Barrett offered absolute silence in response to the question, his weak grip slowly releasing Henry's wrist as his eyes drifted fearfully toward the rain-slicked window. For the absolute first time since meeting the legendary Navy SEAL, Henry saw an expression of pure, unadulterated terror stamped across the old man's face. This was not the common fear of physical harm or death, for Walter had survived multiple gunshot wounds and brutal combat zones throughout his historic career without ever flinching. This was something far more profound, the suffocating, agonizing fear of an exhausted man who was running from a life of immense trauma and could not bear to face reality again. Henry recognized the deep psychological pain instantly and chose not to push the old man for immediate answers, deciding that preserving his life was the absolute priority. Instead of dialing emergency services, Henry called Pastor Wilson from his local church, and together they spent the next hour carefully lifting Walter onto his cot. They spent the evening patiently feeding the old man small, warm spoonfuls of the nutritious beef stew and ensuring he consumed enough fluids to stabilize his dangerously low blood pressure. By 9 o'clock that evening, Walter had finally fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, his color returning to his cheeks as his breathing became rhythmic and steady. Henry sat quietly in the folding metal chair by the window, staring across the dim room at the sleeping warrior, while a storm of questions raced through his mind. He desperately needed to find an emergency contact number, a medical insurance card, or a legal identification document, because he knew that if Walter collapsed like this again, he might not survive to see the morning. Henry approached the worn duffel bag sitting in the corner, initially finding nothing but neatly rolled clothes, a basic shaving kit, and military-issued towels. He then turned his attention to the open cardboard shoebox on the shelf, looking past the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, and the beautiful photograph of Helen. Henry reached deep beneath the layers of velvet lining, and his fingers brushed against a thick official legal document hidden at the absolute bottom of the box. He pulled the document out into the dim light of the single hanging bulb, unfolding the heavy legal-sized paper with a sense of immense hesitation. His eyes raced across the formal text, and his breath caught completely in his throat as he read the bold header at the top of the page. The document was an official power of attorney and absolute transfer of operational authority, legally executing a total transition of corporate control. The grantor of the document was listed plain as day, Walter T. Barrett, co-founder, majority shareholder, and chairman emeritus of Ironclad Security Group. The grantee receiving total control was identified as Raymond J. Connors, Chief Executive Officer of the exact same corporation. Henry read the document 3 separate times, his hands starting to shake violently as the sheer magnitude of the discovery washed over him. He pulled out his cell phone with trembling fingers, opened his internet browser, and typed the words "Ironclad Security Group" into the search bar. The official corporate website loaded within seconds, displaying a massive, highly secure portal that identified the firm as America's premier private defense and security consulting corporation. The company boasted massive multi-year government defense contracts across 14 separate nations, maintaining a global workforce of over 3,000 elite operators, and generating an estimated annual revenue of $580 million. Henry clicked on the history section of the website, and a professional photograph from a high-level Pentagon ceremony filled his screen. The picture featured 2 powerful men in custom-tailored Italian suits, shaking hands with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both of them smiling confidently for the cameras. The caption beneath the photo identified the individuals as co-founders, Walter Barrett and Ray Connors, celebrating the acquisition of Ironclad's 500th international defense contract. The man on the left was Ray Connors, a broad-shouldered, silver-haired executive with an air of absolute authority. The man on the right was a younger, healthier version of Walter Barrett, carrying 60 additional pounds of muscle and looking like a man who could command an entire army with a single word. Despite the physical differences caused by months of starvation and grief, the powerful jawline, the impeccable posture, and the piercing blue eyes were absolutely identical to the old man sleeping on the cot. Henry slowly lowered his phone, looking across the tiny bare room at the frail figure wrapped in a cheap blanket. The mind-bending reality hit him like an absolute freight train. The old man he had been buying $4 cans of grocery store soup for was actually a multi-millionaire titan of global industry. The following morning, the storm had finally passed, and Walter Barrett was sitting upright on the edge of his military cot, his physical strength visibly returning. Henry Griffin sat quietly across from him on the folding metal chair, maintaining an intense, unyielding silence that filled the small room with immense tension. Henry slowly reached into his front pocket, pulled out the heavy brass challenge coin, and placed it gently onto the center of the wooden table between them. Henry looked the old man dead in the eye, his voice low and incredibly steady, as he stated plainly that Walter had single-handedly built Ironclad Security Group. The entire room fell into an absolute breathless standstill as Walter stared down at the gleaming brass token, realizing that his grand secret had been completely unraveled. Walter let out a long, defeated sigh, looking up at Henry with a face stripped of all corporate armor, and calmly admitted that he had indeed built the global empire alongside his partner Ray many years ago. Henry leaned forward, his voice rising slightly in absolute bewilderment as he pointed out that Walter was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet he was choosing to live in a freezing, run-down room eating canned food. Walter's face remained entirely flat, his voice sounding like a seasoned commander reading a detached mission report about someone else's tragic life. He explained that when Helen became terminally ill, he made a strict, unbreakable vow never to touch a single cent of the company's corporate funds to pay for her medical treatments. He believed with every fiber of his being that the $500 million belonged to the 3,000 employees and their families who risked their lives for the firm, and he refused to drain the collective well for his own personal salvation. Walter confessed that when Helen finally closed her eyes for the last time, his entire world became entirely meaningless, and he no longer desired to be the wealthy, powerful tycoon everyone expected him to be. He simply wanted to strip away the material wealth, shed the heavy burden of command, and vanish completely into the shadows to mourn his wife until his time on earth was finished. Henry's jaw tightened as he looked at the proud warrior, stating firmly that with all due respect, elite special forces operators do not run away from life, and Marines do not allow their military brothers to die of starvation in a lonely room. Henry insisted that they needed to immediately contact his former partner Ray Connors, because Walter had spent his entire life saving thousands of lives across the globe, and it was finally time to let someone save his own life in return. Walter stared at the young Marine for a long, grueling minute, his icy defense mechanisms completely fracturing as the sheer weight of his loneliness finally broke through his stubborn pride. Tears welled up in the corners of the old SEAL's piercing blue eyes as he let out a barely audible whisper, finally giving Henry permission to make the call. Henry stepped out onto the narrow wooden staircase that afternoon, his heart hammering against his ribs as he dialed the primary corporate phone number for Ironclad Security Group's main headquarters in Washington, D.C. A highly professional, polished receptionist answered the line on the second ring, routinely asking how she could direct his call through the corporate portal. Henry took a deep, steady breath, commanding her to listen with extreme care, because he needed to speak directly with the Chief Executive Officer, Ray Connors, immediately. The receptionist offered a cold, professional chuckle, informing Henry that Mr. Connors was an incredibly busy man who strictly did not accept unsolicited phone calls from the general public. Henry gripped the phone tightly, his voice carrying the immense weight of an operational command as he told her to inform Mr. Connors that Walter Barrett was alive and desperately needed his help. The line went into an absolute, breathtaking dead silence for 5 seconds before the receptionist's professional demeanor completely shattered. Henry was placed on immediate hold for less than a minute before a sudden click signaled that the line had been transferred directly to a private office. A deep, heavily controlled masculine voice filled the receiver, demanding to know who was on the line and asking if the information about Walter was an authentic truth. Henry identified himself as a Marine reservist located in Norfolk, calmly explaining that he had been secretly looking after Walter Barrett for the past month after finding him starving in a pawn shop. Henry revealed that the old man had suffered a dangerous physical collapse due to severe malnutrition and dehydration, and he immediately provided the exact address of the rundown apartment building. Ray Connors didn't engage in a single second of corporate small talk or demand any further verification, shouting a fierce command for Henry to hold the position and ensure Walter did not disappear before hanging up the phone. Henry lowered his device with shaking hands, praying that he had made the correct decision for a legendary warrior who had desperately fought to remain hidden from the world. At exactly 8:45 that identical Wednesday evening, a fleet of pristine black luxury sedans pulled up along the curb directly outside Walter's rundown apartment building. The lead vehicle was followed closely by a high-end private medical transport van outfitted with state-of-the-art life support equipment and staffed by elite corporate physicians. The heavy rear door of the primary sedan flung open, and Ray Connors stepped out into the damp evening air looking like a powerful titan of industry in a multi-$1,000 custom suit. Despite his wealthy appearance, his face carried an expression of profound, agonizing desperation that belonged to a man who had spent 18 months searching for his missing brother. Henry Griffin was waiting at the entrance of the building, and Ray immediately marched toward him, his sharp corporate eyes instantly analyzing Henry's oil-stained hands, work boots, and the Marine Corps ring on his right finger. Ray gripped Henry's hand with immense force, holding the connection for several extra seconds as he offered a deeply emotional thank you for refusing to give up on his best friend. The long-awaited reunion inside the tiny room was incredibly quiet, devoid of any exaggerated Hollywood drama or loud emotional outbursts as the two old warriors simply stood 3 feet apart. Ray stared down at Walter's gaunt, hollow face and frail frame, his powerful jaw tightening violently as his eyes filled with thick tears that he quickly blinked away. Ray shook his head in absolute disbelief, calling Walter a stubborn old fool, and demanding to know why he had put everyone through 18 months of agonizing worry. Ray explained that he had deployed teams of elite former intelligence operators and top private investigators across the country, all of whom insisted that if a legendary seal didn't want to be found, he would remain a ghost forever. Walter sat quietly on the edge of his thin mattress, keeping his eyes focused on the floorboards, as he whispered that he simply wasn't ready to face the world after Helen passed away. Ray pulled up the folding metal chair, sitting directly knee to knee with his lifelong friend, and stated fiercely that Walter should have called him to confess that he didn't know how to be alive without her. The corporate medical team moved into the room with absolute efficiency, carefully administering an intravenous hydration line and conducting a thorough physical evaluation of Walter's vital systems. Ray immediately took absolute charge of the situation, organizing a luxury apartment lease nearby, a comprehensive long-term medical care team, and a specialized nutritional plan. Ray insisted that this was not a gesture of charity, revealing that the corporate board had been holding millions of dollars in back pay and stock dividends that Walter rightfully earned for building half the empire from scratch. Throughout the entire process, Henry Griffin stood quietly by the front door, his heart filled with immense relief knowing that the old man was finally safe and rescued from his dangerous isolation. Henry quietly reached for his worn jacket, preparing to slip away into the night, because he believed this was private family business that he had no right to interfere with. Suddenly, Ray Connor's powerful voice boomed across the room, demanding to know exactly where the young Marine thought he was going. Henry turned around, explaining politely that he didn't want to intrude on their private matters, but Ray commanded him to sit back down immediately because they were far from finished. Ray walked directly over to Henry, revealing that Walter had spent the last hour recounting every single detail of Henry's immense sacrifices over the past month. Ray listed off the events clearly: the dramatic intervention at the pawn shop, the thousands of dollars of free groceries, the constant automobile rides, and Henry's absolute refusal to accept a single penny of financial reward. Ray looked Henry dead in the eye, stating that Walter had also revealed the secret contents of the yellow legal pad hidden inside his pickup truck. Ray explained that Walter had praised Henry as a phenomenal leader with the massive heart of a protector and the highly analytical brain of a master corporate operator. Henry stood completely frozen in absolute speechlessness as the multimillionaire CEO revealed that Ironclad Security Group maintained a massive underfunded community outreach division that had been entirely directionless ever since Walter walked away from the firm. Ray explained that the company desperately required an elite director with unyielding integrity to take absolute control of the veteran housing and community mentorship initiatives. Ray extended his hand toward the stunned mechanic, offering him a formal corporate position as the chief executive director of the entire Ironclad Community Initiative, with a massive starting salary of $85,000 a year alongside full medical benefits for his entire family. Henry Griffin stood in the center of the dim room, his mind spinning in absolute disbelief as he frantically shook his head and tried to decline the massive corporate offer. He looked at Ray Connors, stammering out that he was just a simple mechanic who fixed broken automobiles for a living and possessed absolutely no corporate management experience. Ray let out a warm, booming laugh, placing a powerful hand on Henry's shoulder and stating that Henry had just saved the life of a multi-millionaire tycoon with nothing but a single bag of groceries and a refusal to quit. Ray insisted that Henry should never tell him what he was incapable of doing, immediately laying out a highly specific, legally binding business proposition that would completely transform the entire Norfolk community. Ray revealed that Ironclad Security Group would immediately provide a massive $1.2 million capital investment to completely fund the construction of Henry's Dream Mentorship Center. The corporation would fully purchase the abandoned warehouse on Miller Street, cover the entire architectural renovation costs, and fully fund a complete staffing budget for 3 consecutive years of operation. Furthermore, Ray announced that the corporation was establishing the official Helen Barrett Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing $50,000 of annual financial aid to help underprivileged neighborhood kids pursue careers in military service, health care, and education. Ray explained that Henry would single-handedly sit on the executive selection committee to choose the recipients of the scholarship every single year. Henry turned his head slowly to look at Walter, and the old veteran gave a firm, emotional nod of approval from his cot, telling the young Marine that he had thoroughly earned every single bit of this miracle. Henry's voice cracked with deep emotion as he extended his hand to Ray, and the powerful CEO pulled him into a fierce brotherly embrace that completely bypassed all corporate formality. Exactly 3 months later, a beautiful ribbon-cutting ceremony took place on a glorious sunny Saturday morning on Miller Street in the heart of downtown Norfolk. The weather was absolutely perfect, carrying a warm breeze that made the entire neighborhood feel as though the universe was finally paying attention to their struggles. The property used to be a massive, dangerous, abandoned warehouse, covered in heavy graffiti and broken windows, a dark place that local residents would actively cross the street to avoid at night. Now a massive, beautifully painted wooden sign hung proudly above the magnificent glass entrance, reading the Griffin Community Mentorship Center in bold lettering. The interior of the building had been completely transformed into a state-of-the-art facility, featuring bright tutoring rooms with brand-new mahogany desks, a high-tech computer lab outfitted with 20 modern workstations, a pristine athletic gym complete with a professional boxing ring and a fully equipped commercial kitchen where kids could learn to cook healthy meals. Every single line room and structural detail that Henry had meticulously sketched on his yellow legal pad during his brief lunch breaks was now fully realized in solid brick mortar and glass. Henry stood at the center of a beautiful wooden podium in front of a massive crowd of hundreds of cheering neighborhood residents, feeling incredibly nervous in his tailored suit. He kept his opening speech remarkably short and powerful, stating clearly into the microphone that this magnificent building did not belong to him, but rather to every single child who walked through the front doors and decided that their life was worth fighting for. The entire crowd erupted into a massive wave of thunderous applause, while his grandmother Loretta wept tears of pure joy in the front row, and Pastor Wilson shouted a powerful amen that echoed across the entire block. The incredible story was immediately captured by local news networks, running a massive headline feature about a young Marine's radical act of kindness, triggering a millionaire's historic return and a community's total revival. Within 48 hours, major national media networks picked up the story, broadcasting a special prime-time segment across the country under a headline crawl that read, "The $38 that changed 2 lives forever." Henry agreed to complete just one single television interview, and when a prominent national reporter asked him how it felt to transition from an underpaid mechanic to the director of a multi-million-dollar community facility, Henry offered a brilliantly grounded response. He smiled calmly, stating that he felt exactly the same, because he was still spending his days fixing broken things. He was simply utilizing a set of much larger corporate tools now. Henry looked directly into the television camera, delivering a powerful final message to millions of viewers across the nation, pleading with them that the next time they see a struggling human being counting loose coins at a grocery register, they must never look away. The inspiring video clip of Henry Griffin's interview went absolutely viral across the internet, accumulating over 2 million views within its first week, and triggering a massive tidal wave of positive ripple effects throughout the state. The most profound and immediate change occurred within the walls of Henry's own home, as Ironclad's elite executive health insurance package completely transformed his grandmother's life. For the absolute first time in his existence, Henry possessed top-tier medical coverage that allowed him to immediately secure the absolute best healthcare professionals for Loretta's severe diabetes management. She was paired with top-rated specialists, provided with advanced automated insulin monitoring equipment, and given access to premium dietary support systems without Henry ever having to look at a single bill. Loretta completely stopped rationing her vital medication. Her chronic knee pain subsided significantly, and she began sleeping peacefully through the entire night without a single ounce of financial anxiety. She quickly refused to sit idle at home and began volunteering at the Mentorship Center 3 days a week, establishing a wildly popular reading program for the neighborhood toddlers, known as Miss Loretta's Story Hour. Every afternoon, dozens of young children would frantically compete with one another to see who could sit closest to her rocking chair as she read beautiful stories with a booming, joyful voice. Simultaneously, Pastor Wilson's local church food pantry formed an official corporate partnership with the center's commercial kitchen, instantly doubling its operational reach and logistics capabilities. Families who previously had to catch multiple city buses to reach a distant food bank could now simply walk 3 blocks to receive high-quality fresh produce and hot meals. Walter Barrett had moved into a gorgeous, sunlit luxury apartment located just 2 blocks away from the mentorship facility, featuring a warm fireplace, pristine hardwood floors, and a modern kitchen. The legendary Navy SEAL began volunteering at the facility every single Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, personally conducting advanced discipline, mental resilience, and life skills seminars for the local teenagers. The rough inner-city kids quickly labeled the intense old warrior as Chief, a powerful title that Walter outwardly pretended to dislike, though deep down it brought an immense sense of purpose back into his lonely chest. During his second week of class, a 15-year-old kid named Devin, who possessed a severe history of school suspensions and aggressive anger issues, sat in the back row with his arms tightly crossed and his jaw locked in defiance. Walter marched directly over to the young man, looking past his defensive exterior, and stated calmly that Devin reminded him exactly of himself when he was a young, angry kid who hated the entire world without knowing why. Devin slowly uncrossed his arms as he looked up into the old veteran's sincere, understanding blue eyes, marking the absolute beginning of a profound personal transformation. Exactly 6 months later, Devin made the school's official academic honor roll for the absolute first time in his entire life, proudly presenting Walter with a handwritten letter thanking the chief for refusing to give up on him when everyone else did. Walter carefully carried the letter back to his apartment, placing it inside his historic cardboard shoebox directly next to Helen's beautiful photograph. The first official round of the Helen Barrett Memorial Scholarship was successfully distributed to 6 exceptional neighborhood youth, including a brilliant young woman named Keisha, who fully enrolled in a top-tier university nursing program. Another 19-year-old named Travis utilized the funds to fully cover his intensive emergency medical technician training, while 4 other local youth received full financing to pursue careers in public education and social work. A massive anonymous video was suddenly uploaded to the internet featuring a brief 30-second clip of Walter and Henry playfully sparring inside the center's boxing ring. Walter was 73 years old with visible medical bruises on his arms, yet he was moving across the canvas like a lightning-fast warrior, half his age, delivering brilliant combinations while laughing hysterically. Henry was backing away with his hands raised in defensive amusement, shouting for the chief to chill out because they had explicitly agreed to a light training session. The spectacular video exploded across social media platforms, capturing over 4 million views within 48 hours and inspiring thousands of military veterans to share their own moving stories of survival. Henry's former employer at Patterson's Auto Body proudly hung a massive framed photograph of Henry directly behind the main payment counter, accompanied by a beautiful handwritten sign stating that Henry used to fix broken cars at this facility, but he was now dedicated to fixing broken futures. Even Denise, the observant grocery store cashier, who had initially recognized the corporate logo on the challenge coin, received a beautiful personal envelope delivered directly to her register. Inside was a hand-signed thank you card from Ray Connors himself, accompanied by a massive $5,000 corporate bonus check for serving as an accidental intelligence asset for the firm. The absolute most profound aspect of this incredible story was not the massive corporate funding, the state-of-the-art facility, the viral internet fame, or the national media accolades. It was a quiet, unscripted moment that took place on a cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 6 months after the grand opening of the community center. At 5:45 in the evening, Henry Griffin was finally preparing to exit the facility after completing an exhausting 12-hour workday filled with intensive corporate budget meetings, adolescent mentorship sessions, and expansion planning calls with Ray Connors. The weather outside was a miserable, freezing gray downpour that looked absolutely identical to the historic day he had first encountered Walter Barrett inside the pawn shop. Henry pulled his truck into the parking lot of the Save Right grocery store on Jefferson Avenue, needing to pick up a gallon of whole milk for his grandmother who was baking her celebrated homemade cobbler in their new kitchen. He grabbed the heavy plastic jug from the dairy aisle and stepped into the long checkout line, shaking the cold rainwater from his heavy jacket. Suddenly, his eyes locked onto a young woman standing at the front of the register, wearing faded medical scrubs from a local nursing clinical program. She had massive, dark circles of exhaustion stamped beneath her eyes, a crying infant balanced precariously on her hip, and a small toddler tightly gripping her pant leg. The young mother was meticulously counting out loose copper pennies and nickels onto the conveyor belt, with slow, trembling fingers engaging in the painful ritual of someone who already knows they do not possess enough money but must try anyway. Her simple items consisted of a single container of infant formula, a small pack of diapers, a loaf of white bread, and 2 small jars of baby food. The automated cash register screen suddenly flashed the final total, and Henry watched the young mother freeze completely as the cashier gently informed her that she was short by nearly $7. A crushing wave of deep embarrassment and shame washed over the young woman's tired face, and she slowly reached forward to hand the loaf of bread back to the cashier with trembling hands. Henry Griffin didn't hesitate for a single second, instantly stepping forward from the back of the line, placing his own corporate debit card onto the scanner, and commanding the cashier to ring all her family items directly with his own. The young mother spun around in absolute shock, her eyes filling with thick tears of gratitude as she frantically whispered that he didn't have to do this for her. Henry offered her the exact same calm, reassuring smile he had given to a starving Navy SEAL in a dusty pawn shop a lifetime ago. He looked her gently in the eyes, stating softly that an incredible stranger had once done the exact same thing for his family, teaching him that true human brotherhood possesses an absolute expiration date. And he knew that magnificent rule applied to sisterhood as well. The young woman was completely unable to articulate her immense gratitude, simply nodding her head silently as she whispered a beautiful thank you before carrying her bags out into the rain. Henry paid for his milk, and as he stepped up to the counter, Denise looked at him from behind the register, offering a beautiful silent smile of profound respect that required absolutely no spoken words. When Henry finally arrived back at his apartment that evening, he noticed a beautifully wrapped heavy mahogany package sitting on the kitchen table that had been delivered by a private courier service. He carefully clipped the security seal and pulled off the lid, discovering a gorgeous custom-made velvet shadow box protecting a stunning historic artifact beneath the glass. It was an authentic polished military Purple Heart medal, the exact same medal that Walter Barrett had desperately tried to trade for $40. Tucked neatly beneath the frame was a small piece of heavy stationery paper containing a beautifully written message in that familiar, precise calligraphy handwriting. The note read that Walter had managed to purchase the sacred honor back from Gill's pawn shop, because certain invaluable things in this world are never meant to be sold, but are instead meant to be passed down to true warriors. Walter wrote that the historic medal now belonged entirely to Henry, not because he had fought in a foreign war overseas, but because he had chosen to fight with everything he had for a total stranger, which required a completely different kind of ultimate courage. Henry held the heavy shadow box tightly against his chest for a long emotional moment, his heart swelling with an immense sense of pride and connection. He walked into his bedroom and carefully placed the beautiful frame onto his wooden shelf, positioning it neatly right next to his mother's photograph, the folded American flag, and the heavy brass challenge coin. Those four magnificent objects stood aligned in a perfect row, a mother's eternal love, a nation's deep gratitude, a brother's unbreakable coin, and a warrior's massive heart. It was a beautiful shelf that perfectly articulated the complete, inspiring story of a young Marine who chose to give away his absolute last dollar to save a life. Somewhere across the quiet streets of Norfolk, inside a warm, beautiful luxury apartment located just 2 blocks away from a thriving mentorship center, an old Navy SEAL sat peacefully by his window. Walter Barrett took a slow sip of his warm coffee, looking out at the evening rain with a serene smile spreading across his face for the first time in 18 months. He no longer desired to disappear from the world. He wanted to stay right here and fight for his community.